Welcome back, YouTube. This is another reaction to Tim Cain. If you're wondering why I am dressed as a devil, that is not for Tim Cain, but that is because we reached 666 followers over on Twitch, and I promised that I would wear this. So the plan is to maybe wear this in the future too, but just ignore the costume and let's watch Tim Cain. This one is on game simplification, and my voice is already starting to go, so forgive me for that one.
Hi everyone, it's me, Tim.
Hi, Tim.
Today I want to talk about game simplification.
Yeah.
And by this I'm talking about various ways games can be made easier to use, but to some players feel hand-holdy. This is me answering a question from
VA. See, this is a good one because Tim looks like he's about to bite me. That's angry. This is a good one because there are a lot of games with broad appeal. You know, take a look at a game like, what's a recent one that came out? Dragon Age Veilguard. Everybody hated it. Well, okay, that's not true. But it had a broad appeal. The problem with broad appeal is that you do need to set up your systems in a way that is enough for people on the lower end of the gaming spectrum, so people who don't really know how to play games very well, to get into the game, but for people on the high end of the spectrum to not be too upset with the number of tutorials and shit that occurs at the start of a game. That is a big problem, especially that every single genre, every single game, every single market is going to be different. You know, if you're playing like real-time strategy games, you might have certain assumptions for people who are used to real-time strategies that may not be there for like a super casual game, because generally speaking, people who play RTS games are usually more competent with games than people who play casual games. Or people who play a lot of casual games, jumping over to RTS games may not know how to play, and a game without a good tutorial or that good user experience, that good, I guess tutorialization is the word that I am looking for. You know, it may filter people out who are like, this is too complex, I don't know how to play it, game turned off.
From VA Camus, who asks, recently I saw some screenshots from games with very obvious clues where to go next. I mean, like very obvious gray rock formations with obvious yellow
paint. Oh no. Oh no, I don't want to talk about yellow paint today. I don't want to do it. Yes, I will talk about yellow paint. Okay. I fucking hate yellow paint. I'm going to give you a really, really maybe controversial opinion. Stop putting yellow paint in your games. I don't care. I don't care what your market, what your target audience is. If you are so inept at finding better ways to show the player where to go, maybe you shouldn't be making a game. And yellow paint collectively dumbs down every single gamer, because if the new standard in games is to use yellow paint to show players where to jump and where to climb, then guess what? Every player is going to expect yellow paint, and everybody who's new to gaming that starts to play games will look for yellow paint. If we all just collectively as an industry stopped using yellow paint, players would have to adapt to not having yellow paint. Stop doing it. There are so many better ways. Portal 2 is a great example of a game that I think, and Portal 1 actually, can somebody find a good screen? Wait, Portal yellow paint. I know that there was a good example going around with Portal. Not that. There was a really, really good, oh my god, why does this have zero updates? Yellow paint is not the fault of dumb players, it's entirely on developers. And it's got 0 upvotes and 313 comments. I'm gonna be honest, I think it's a bit of both. I think that doing things like yellow paint, Portal game yellow paint, if you find a screenshot, if you know what I'm talking about, I'm just trying to look for an example of it being used better. Yellow paint game design debate. Know your meme. It's everywhere, dude. It's absolutely everywhere. I can't find it. Look, either way, there's so many better ways. You can have lights turned on over beneath a door. You can have clutter that's around a certain area. You can point the player in a direction with like blood stains, right? There's so many better ways to do yellow paint than yellow paint. And it collectively dumbs down an entire audience of players. And guess what? I do think that if designers choose to collectively dumb down players, players collectively become more stupid. And now you have to constantly chase this minimum viable intellect or minimum denominator for intellect in the player base that you're making a game for. And it's stupid. It's really stupid. Just stop treating your players as dumb. Let the dumb players filter themselves out or try to actually learn the game and make a game better. There's a really good GDC. You talk about it. Why Nathan Drake doesn't need a compass. That does sound interesting, actually. Talks about using light to guide. Yeah, light is a great one. I think that light is a really common use, and it's beyond just level design. Yeah, it's just lazy level design and level composition. I agree. Everything is a byproduct of something else, so the main issue could be dumb players and devs had to adapt. I think that they go hand in hand. If you ask me, they go hand in hand. I had a tweet about it a while ago. Let me see if I can pull it up. Where is it? I think I worded it pretty well here. Not that. That was another weird one. Here it is. I found it. Yellow paint is a good accessibility option, but making it the new default is a step backwards for level design. In playtests, you might hear, I didn't know that box was breakable, or I didn't know that ledge was climbable. The discussion should be centered around effective tutorialization, level design standards, and the art direction of interactables. Not every Reddit poster or playtester who gets stuck means your game's rating is going to tank. A concerted and proactive effort to engage the curiosity and brain power of gamers will pay off not just for your game, but for the industry as a whole. The summary of this may not be what anyone wants to hear, but I think Josh Strife Hayes, by the way, shout out to JSH, puts it best when he said that gamers need to meet developers halfway with games. What that means to me as a dev is that if I want to pique the interest of players, I need to not treat them like idiots or jump on the paint cannon the moment there's friction. And as a gamer, opening my brain for the first couple of hours and making a real attempt to learn what the game is trying to teach me will, in almost every case, increase my understanding of the game and subsequently increase my enjoyment. And I think that is a more succinct way of putting it than I just said now. You love JSH? Yeah, JSH is great, by the way. If you guys aren't watching Josh Strife Hayes, watch Josh Strife Hayes.
Protrusions to stick to, ancient ladders painted in yellow, etc. I don't actually know from what games those were. What is your stance on hand-holding the player in games and or freedom for letting them get lost? I'm just going to say the whole freedom thing kind of is a separate issue, and I'm all for various degrees of freedom and open.
I mean, it's ultimately just how do you teach the player, and I think that if it's consistency, right? So if you are consistent in your level design and you show the player that if they can reach a ladder, they can climb it, then players you need to do is force the player to climb a ladder once, and now the player learns this. The same thing is with breakable boxes, and I think Resident Evil 4 was a good example because the original game in Resident Evil 4 didn't have the yellow paint on boxes. The remake had yellow paint on boxes. All you need to do is teach the player that these can break and sometimes have items inside. That's it. Now if you have consistent box meshes, consistent materials being used for this, right? Like a very understandable brown color for anything that can break. Or just the same meshes being used throughout the game, which I think players are okay with because they want understanding before they want immersion in many cases. So if you use the same mesh, nobody gives a shit. All that they need to say is, oh, there's a breakable crate, let me go break it and see if there's anything inside. That consistency can build skill and trust within the developer. But if you have, well, some ladders can be climbable, some can't. Some things are breakable, some aren't. That lack of consistency now makes the player question, well, I don't know what to engage with in the world because the developer hasn't taught me any sort of consistent method for figuring out what I can and can't engage with. I mean, so consistency, though, I think is part of tutorialization because you're teaching the player this is how this game specifically works. And every game might work differently, but in a game like Resident Evil, where they had the same mesh being used for boxes that are breakable, all you needed to learn was, oh, break the box, and you might find some things inside. Now you see that same mesh throughout the world, understanding. Sorry, Tim, please continue.
Various degrees of freedom and open world and all that, and I think that's great. And if players get lost, they have fun with that, and that's a whole question about whether to have maps and map icons and all that. But I want to stick to the things that are being done to make the game simpler or simplified, or what some people call hand-holdy.
Yeah, and I think that I like that he hasn't used the word accessible here because I don't think that yellow paint is an accessibility option. Unlike, color blindness, right? That is actually helping the game become more accessible to people who can't see color properly. Yellow paint is an accessibility option for idiots. Now the game is playable by idiots. Well, how about don't be an idiot, right? And I think that it's not about IQ or anything. It's about what is your general understanding of games. And if you haven't taken the proper time to learn basic gaming knowledge, then this is the perfect time to do it in my game. So learn of the things that you can climb, learn the things that you can break, but that is also half on the developer side. You need to make it consistent and teach the player properly so that they don't need to think that yellow paint is a necessity.
Now, this is a dilemma that has always existed. There's always been this question of how obvious do we make this? Do we point the player in this direction? Do we how many clues do we have? And let me just tell you now that as a designer, it always seems like no matter how much you give in clues on where the player's supposed to go, how they're supposed to do something, how they're supposed to complete this quest, for some group of players, it never seems like it's enough.
This is true.
And they rage quit in frustration because they couldn't figure out that, the gems had to be put in order, even though the NPC said that. Versus other players who get upset, as OP mentioned, like, okay, that's a very obvious place I can climb up, but did you have to, paint it in bright yellow so it's obvious that's where I continue?
Mm-hmm. Hey Kylie, I'm partially blind and I wish I could play more FPS and other games with quality graphics, but sometimes it's difficult to identify objects that blend in with the environment. I think having some kind of highlight like yellow paint as an accessibility option would be helpful. Look, I'll say this. If it is an option that can be turned off, no problem with it. None at all. Or turned on in your case, right? Because you need it for specific reasons. I think that some games can do it well, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not partially blind. You would know better. Resident Evil 4 rates. I think that there are some cases where these do blend into the environment and making them, have that yellow paint is useful, but also reusing the exact same mesh to denote which crates are breakable is probably helpful. But I will reiterate, if it is an option, I care a lot less than when it is forced on for all players. Because it does impact immersion, right? Same thing with, I don't know, like an accessibility option that helps players hear so they can see like a representation of the enemy walking patterns or something. Anything like that could be considered cheating or immersion breaking, like I think yellow paint is. These things should at least be either turned off by default or have a toggle so that the player can enjoy the game as it's meant to be played. And for people who do have disabilities, they can experience that accessibility option without that. But yeah, I also do agree that in some cases that can be solved in other ways. That if something is blending into the environment too well, maybe this is the intention of the designer, or the artist, but maybe this is the a fault of not having that having consistency or having good, what's the word I'm looking for? Contrast between elements in the scene. Yeah, I mean, I think that I think that there's a difference though between accessibility options and things that are meant to are meant to appease the idiots playing. And I'm not saying that you with a disability are an idiot. You actually have a disability. That is a real thing that needs to be addressed, as opposed to people who are like, oh, I don't know where to go. Whatever, quit this game. Couldn't even sit and think for like 10 seconds, right?
Now, like I said, this dilemma for designers have always existed, but it's becoming more and more an issue in these very profit-oriented times. Because let me spell out the issue more clearly. It is namely this: should a designer add a feature that makes the game sales increase even if players say they don't want that feature?
The bigger the budget, the more yes that becomes, right? We talk about it all the time. The bigger the budget of your game, the more money you need to make back. And there's only two ways to do that: increase PPU, increase market, or both. That's it. That's it. So to increase the market, you expand the game to be playable by more people. And in a lot of cases, it's casual gamers because there are a lot of casual gamers. So you have games that have journalist difficulty modes, uh, accessibility options that aren't really accessibility, but more just to appease people who can't think for 2 seconds. You know, I will. This is not a shit on people who with disabilities, but arguably speaking, the number of people with disabilities who play games is a relatively small number of gamers compared to the average. And having accessibility options is great, but it doesn't really have as big of an impact on sales as expanding your game to be playable by people who aren't as smart with playing games. Having, like I said, a journalist difficulty mode or a super easy story difficulty. Candy Crush Saga used to highlight valid moves if you didn't do anything for like 10 seconds. These days it highlights the next move instantly. Oh boy. Does it really? That's crazy. There's no way that's true. They still happen at hyper casual levels. Yeah, it's just, I think that there's a collective dumbing down of players, and that any sort of conflict or friction that the player has with the developers is seen as bad. I mean, take a look. Here's a good example. When people play Cauldron Chronicles initially before this rework, they thought the alchemy system was complex. Now, I could make it easier, but I think the alchemy system is easy. It just requires a good tutorialization to teach. And honestly speaking, if you're judging the first 2 to 3 hours of a game and whether or not the player understands it, it's not the greatest judge of whether or not they still understand it after 10 to 20 hours. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't have a good tutorial, but players likely will feel a little bit confused about a game's mechanics when they load up a mechanic heavy systems driven game for the first time. Most people, when they load up RimWorld, probably fail their first few games. That's kind of normal, even though the game does have a pretty decent tutorial to teach you. It just takes time to learn games with a lot of this depth and complexity. Debate isn't about should games be accessible to everyone. Of course, ideally, anyone willing should be able to play a game. The question is about at what point does complexity necessitate assistance from a developer, and to what degree should a player be expected to solve something without intervention? Yeah, I agree with that too. Yeah, 100%. I think that's where my complaints with stuff like yellow paint comes into. Sometimes friction is good. Sometimes friction is understandable. First couple hours of a game. And sometimes friction is a legitimate result of the designer's failure to properly tutorialize or maintain consistency.
Because let's unpack what that means. OP mentioned a yellow color being used to indicate where the player can climb.
Yeah.
Now, notice in this case, there is absolutely no functionality added to the game. Players can climb there, no matter whether they see that it's in color or not. Like, I may miss that, by the way. You may think it's a brightly colored yellow, but for me, it may be the same as the gray that the rocks are. So I may not even notice it. Yep. But the area is climbable no matter what. So it didn't add any kind of functionality, but it did make it easier for the player to figure out what to do. This is hand-holding. I understand why people call it that. It is basically saying, hey, we know there's this thing you got to figure out. We're going to make it easier. But just so you know, hand-holding has a whole spectrum of things that people can mean by saying this game is very hand-holdy. So let's look at this in one very narrow context. Let's talk about shooting a gun. And let's talk about all the ways that games get hand-holdy. And I'll start low and move to high. So a very low one is an aiming reticle. almost every shooting game has an aiming reticle on the screen.
Or use like WASD to move the mouse left to move the gun left. Wow, I didn't think of that myself. Here's two good examples that I can use that I think are pretty funny. Far Cry... What's the dragon? Dragon Blood tutorial. Blood Dragon, not Blood, but Dragon Blood. I think that this game did a very good job of tutorializing the player by teaching them that taught the player, but at the same time made fun of having to teach the player.
Acknowledged. Loading basic tutorial batch 101 from Military Navigation for Idiots. Auto-holstering weapons for silent approach.
Oh, you fucking asshole.
Have fun!
Press A to demonstrate your ability to read. See, I appreciate this because it is fun, but it does also kind of teach the player some things. But at the same time, it's like, hey, you have this humorous bit to it so that at the same time that you're learning actually how to play the game, you can just enjoy this funny meme, right?
Ah, for fuck's sake.
Jump if you wish to jump.
Jump if you wish to jump. I love the way it describes it too. Pressing A enables you to move in a Z-axis arc without touching the ground in between.
Spider, I hate you.
Crouch to go lower.
Crouch activates your quadriceps and challenges your sense of balance. It's also true.
Just let me kill people, damn it.
To look around, look around.
This is not cool.
This works so
Movement
perfectly
allows
too
you
in a
to go
Far Cry
many
game.
Exciting directions.
Why?
Running is like walking, only faster.
I love shit like that. I think Seth had a good example too recently with his review of Prey.
Hey, people.
He talked about the goo gun. Where was the goo gun? Where was goo? Yeah, here.
Well, I don't know, but it probably... I don't know. What do you do in Prey? I turn myself into a roll of toilet paper and hide inside the women's bathroom. Because I finished a side quest that puts psychoactive DMT into the drinking water, I can reliably do this for the next few hours. In all seriousness, it's a game of Gmod prop hunt, where you get jump scared by filing cabinets. The difference is, it's a AAA title that doesn't assume the player to be retarded. Here's how they introduce their first weapon. What does it do? Well, I don't know, but it probably freezes enemies and sticks to walls. Oh look, a corpse I can loot. Good thing there's a conveniently ramp-shaped trail of glue I can climb up. Maybe I can use this weapon to climb on other things in the future. Oh, the path upstairs is locked. Good thing I have this glue cannon. Was I stopped in my tracks to explain how this works? No. Was there an NPC in my ear going, "Morgan, squirt your glue to climb upstairs"? No. Did I have to demonstrate my understanding of a weapon and its applications in order to proceed? No. The entire game is like this. It presents a number of obstacles, gives you tools to conquer them, then stands back and lets you figure it out yourself. Ultimately, this isn't complicated, but I have to give praise, because video games are a lowbrow field designed for knuckle draggers. After a solar flare knocks us back to the Bronze Age, they will return to their rightful place, plowing the crops. And I will be a low-ranking overseer until I
I think he explains it properly. I mean, that's an excellent example of a game that properly tutorializes you on how to use a new weapon, not only for how it can affect enemies, but how you can use it for environmental, for climbing. Let's just put it that way, without telling you a single thing about it. I mean, that's exactly how you would want to do it. So there's always a more intelligent way, I think, to teach the player than to simply tell them, here's how you do this thing. There's even humorous ways to get it done that distract the player from the fact that they are learning things. That works too. Yellow paint is really just the lowest form of telling the player where they can go and where to go. There's just so many more infinitely better ways to do it.
Maybe some get rid of it if you're somehow damaged, but I know games that never lose it. There's always a reticle that show if you press the trigger, that's where your bullet's going to hit.
I know a game that doesn't do it. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 and 1.
Well, guess what? There's no aiming reticle in real life, so that's a form of handholding.
Love audio instruction. I feel there's more you can put into terms of tone. Sark. Yeah, I think there is too. Yeah, I think audio instructions can work too. Or I'm just like press jump to jump. I mean, at a certain point, I think assuming that the player knows the basics of playing a game, that nobody's loading up Far Cry Blood Dragon, having never played a game before. I don't know. It's just at a certain point, I think players have to learn how to play games, right? Nobody pulls up a game for the first time, puts a controller in their hand for the first time, and knows how to play console games, right? Nobody does. You have to learn how to play console games. My dad had to learn how to play console games. You know how he played console games when I first got him like playing Skyrim on PS3 or PS4, whatever? He didn't know that how to control the left stick and the right stick independently. So he would move with the left stick and then stop and then move the right stick to look around. Now look at him. He's beaten, Witcher 3 on Death March and telling me about it. It's just you need to have experience. And if the game treats you like Seth said, like a retard, then I think that it just encourages people to continue acting like retards. And that's really what it is. Like, you need to meet the developers halfway, as Josh Strife Hayes says. And if you don't meet the developers halfway, and this goes with fun as well as how to play the game, then you're not going to have any sort of good experience with that game.
In real life. So that's a form of handholding. It is a form of making it easier for you, the player, to play the game. Very few people complain about it, though. And I'm sure a lot of people would complain if the game didn't have it. Now let's go up a step in that spectrum. Aim assist. Aim assist takes a lot of different forms. It could be anything from a sticky aim, meaning when the cursor, the aiming reticle goes over something, and then it goes off of it. If you shoot, the game kind of remembers the last thing you were aiming at, and if the reticle wasn't that far away, it'll still shoot that creature.
Aim assist is accessibility that can be used to cheat. Let's just put it that way. Like it legitimately makes the game easier, and for some people who have a hard time shooting, and it doesn't matter for a single player game, right? But there are multiplayer games with aim assist in them. I agree that it's essential, but also if you have a multiplayer game with and without aim assist, I don't think so. I don't know if you need aim assist. I think that depending on the game, you might not want to have any aim assist. I'll stick to that. Even for controllers, I don't think you need aim assist to play a game with a controller. I just think it makes the game significantly easier. And if you have, like PvP games or something, here's the thing. Think of a game like, Call of Duty, the multiplayer mode or whatever. Somebody with aim assist is at a significant advantage compared to people without it. I mean, you might find it very difficult, but for single player games, have it. For multiplayer games, I think that you would probably not allow it. It just depends. But there's no denying that this is and can be an accessibility feature for people who might, have defects in their hands or whatever, or only have one hand or whatever. And it can also be used to cheat, right? As with a lot of accessibility features, I think. So for single player games, who cares? Who cares about cheating because it's single player? But for multiplayer games, there are accessibility features like that I think cannot and should not be turned on by default because they can be abused. Yeah, it just depends on the genre, I think.
Maybe the reticle itself actually sticks to it, so maybe it's a floating reticle and it actually stays on
Here's a good example. Red Dead Redemption 2 online has really, really good aim assist in terms of you don't have to press anything. You can just aim at an enemy, it sticks to it, and it will follow that character across the screen. And it's fine for multiplayer, or fine for single player, but in multiplayer, it really just trivializes the gameplay. And for people who are choosing to play the game on like PC with mouse and keyboard are at a huge disadvantage. Yeah, it is excessive. I mean, like you said, it just depends on the game.
Last thing that you were over. Sometimes aim assist can also be defined as the hitboxes are a little bigger than they should be, and that way when you change the difficulty options in a game and it says it's increasing aim assist, what it's really doing is saying the creature that looks this big actually has a hitbox that's this big. Now, this can extend even further into something slightly different called bullet magnetism. Bullet magnetism is when you shoot and you've never had your aim on or even close to a creature, but it hits it anyway. Your
Yep.
bullet is literally, you can imagine it, even if it's a hit scan thing, that your bullet aimed, re-aimed itself in trajectory and curved towards and hit a creature that was near your reticule, but you never were over it. And it's even maybe not even that near, depending on how much bullet magnetism you have. Now, to the original players of shooters and FPSs, these were all super handholdy. That's like, oh my god, what are the kids these days needing to play this game? But part of it was introduced because consoles, doing shooters on consoles seemed a lot harder than PC because you get a lot finer control with a mouse.
I mean, it is true, and I think that is the reason that it was implemented, like Tim says, which is why I think that it is a necessary component, especially for single-player games. But then when you have crossplay enabled on multiplayer games for consoles and for multiplayer games, especially games with, like a competitive atmosphere, which unfortunately pretty much every multiplayer game seems to be a competitive atmosphere these days, and I hate it. Then you have that issue of people playing with controller are just at a pure disadvantage in a lot of cases. Now, there are some advantages for having a controller that a mouse doesn't have, but in most cases you are at an advantage when you're playing with mouse and keyboard.
Finer control with a mouse than you do with a controller, and it made PvP on PC versus console very different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So those features started to be added into games, and now their players not only want them, but they expect them, and they justify their being there. I'm sure there's people.
And that's the problem that I see. That's the problem, is the moment you start to make it a standard, the moment yellow paint starts to become a standard, it will become expected. And then players just can load up a game, a new AAA game, and say, oh, I don't have to turn my brain on for this. Let me turn my brain off. Thanks, Mom. Yeah, it's become a standard, and I don't want to do it. I'd rather that the player is like, yeah, there's friction. You don't know what to do. And hopefully I can do a good job with my games to, push the player in the right direction and create that consistency. But the player does have to engage with the game and have to use their brain for once.
People watching right now, they're justifying all the things I just said, which older games didn't have, and they're all a form of hand-holding. It's just, if people have a place on the continuum, and everything below that is like, oh, that's fine, that's not hand-holdy, but this is hand-holdy. But where people fall in that spectrum is very different. So the thing is, beyond players expecting it, this extends to a lot more features than just hand-holdy features. And there are players that say they don't want them, but then they seem to use them if the game has them. And even more, they only buy games that have those things. So that just causes this dilemma of, should I not include it? Because people say they don't want it, but then they seem to use it and they seem to want it. And it's if they're looking at two games and one has it and one doesn't, they usually buy the one that has those features.
Well, here's what I think what Tim said at the start of the video is the best example of this. In most cases, adding yellow paint will not hurt your sales. It will add to your sales. So while it does cut off some people or make some people upset, usually people will still buy the game with it. And then there's usually just mods that can remove it, right? So the people who don't like it are satisfied in some cases with a mod, even though they will buy the game and enjoy it. But people who wouldn't buy the game without the yellow paint will buy it because now it has the yellow paint. So it's just profits. It's just profits. But I can appreciate in an opposite example, people like Miyazaki and developers like From Software who would just say, yeah, this is the difficulty of our game. If you cannot play it on this difficulty, too bad. Mod the game to your liking or go find something else to play. And statistically, people still buy Elden Ring and From Software games. So, money the bane of good design. Yeah, it's just. But look, I don't know what Elden Ring's budget was. Elden Ring budget. What was the budget for Elden Ring? No way, it's 500 mil. About 7 Miyazaki's Tree Fitty. Yeah, that's what I was looking for. 1,000 schmeckles. Okay. 200 mil according to Google. That's pretty high, but I can see it. 100 to 200 million. So that's even less than Dragon Age Veilguard. And, they were... they consistently make the games that they are very confident in making. And it's proved true. Concord was 500, yeah. I don't know. There's just... Look, the bigger the budget, the more money you need to make back. I've said it a million times, I'll say it again. You either increase the price of the game, or you increase the number of people that are going to buy it. Or both. And there are plenty of modern examples where they've tried to do both because they have too big of a budget, and now the game is completely directionless. It doesn't have anything to say. Because if you include this element of the story, people will get offended, and now those people won't buy your game. If you do this, this, or you don't have the yellow paint, now it cuts this people out of the market. So it's kind of like every single AAA game needs to appease the hyper casuals because that's where a lot of the money is. And by doing so, they cut off the more hardcore or even some of the mid-core players. And if you don't have a lot of money to spend, especially if you're a hardcore gamer, you don't have a lot of money to spend in games because you're buying a whole bunch of games, you'll just go to a game that seems to respect your intelligence a bit more. You either make one Concord or 2 Elden Rings in the same budget. That's a good point. So the optimal strategy is to make AA games with smaller budgets. If you want to maintain some level of freedom in the way that you design a game and not have to worry about pissing people off who aren't really going to like your game anyway, then yeah, just make AA games. Work in a budget between, I'll just say $0, but let's say up to 10 mil. Up to 10 mil, you can still recuperate and you can make a very unique game that has a lot of cool things to say, that can be offensive, it can be specific, you can cater to a niche, you can do whatever the hell you want. You can get away with it.
And this extends way beyond like painted ladders and
it does, yeah.
Icons on maps. Difficulty sliders are a big contention. Some people are like, well, I want the game not to have them, just have the designer pick what the difficulty should be. And others are like, nope, I won't buy a game unless it lets me go on story mode.
A designer should always design a game for the default average player. Having difficulty options does not mean that the designers don't know how to design the game. That's not what it means. I hate that example of, oh, you have difficulty customization because you couldn't design the game. No, it's because I know that some people like to play the game a bit easier and a bit harder. And this is my form of accessibility because this is a single player game that doesn't have any impact on other people depending on the play. There's no social, trophy house like with From Software games where if you can't beat it on the highest difficulty, you're not a real gamer. A game like Kerbal Space Program, or for me, the game that I added a lot of customization into is Train Life. Nobody cares what difficulty you play it on. I mean, there's a lot of games like Mass Effect. Nobody really cares what difficulty you played Mass Effect on. They cared what choices you made. Who did you keep alive? Who did you help? Things like that. Knowing when to add difficulty sliders and when difficulty sliders might be a contentious point, I think is an important thing for design. But for most games, having difficulty options is not going to hurt players in any way.
Microtransactions are an extreme version of this. Many
not
people
hate
microtransactions. But guess what?
You know my
you
thoughts.
Put them in the game, and people seem to buy them and use them.
Yep.
And so in some cases, for some types of games and some designs, it's kind of hard to not put them in. It's kind of hard to justify as a designer not putting them in. There are obviously people who want them and will pay money for them.
Well, it's like free-to-play games, right? I think that there can still be pro-consumer business models that don't leech money away from you. Games with cosmetic-only microtransactions are a good example. Nobody cares, right? Cosmetics are just they're just there for social purposes, but they don't affect the game in any way. But I think that there are times too where microtransactions are used by monetization designers in the specific reason of fucking players over. It's all about the psychology at play. Monetization designers need to know psychology because they need to know how to manipulate players into spending money. It's anti-consumer. I mean, really, it's just gambling in this case, right? It's the same kind of form of manipulating players into giving you money. All design is about manipulating emotions, but in this case, it is manipulating emotions to get you to spend money over and over again.
So let's look at the other side of this, and let's look at the objections people have to hand-holdy stuff. The common one is, hey, it reduces the challenge of the game, and it reduces the challenge differently for different people depending on whether or not they turn these on, these hand-holdy options on. Which then brings up the question of, well, if you have options to remove the hand-holdy features, is that okay? For some people, it's like, oh yeah, if I can turn them off, it's fine. Other people are like, no one should have access to this. No one should be able to play the game unless everybody.
Don't tell somebody else how to play their game. I'm going to be honest. Don't tell somebody else how to play their game. Don't do it. And never let somebody else dictate how you should play your game. If it is a single-player game, I think that there's no excuse to bitch and moan about how people play it. If it is a multiplayer game, I can understand, hacks and cheats and things like that. They can have an impact. But if it's a single-player game, who cares? Cheat however much you want. Cosmetic microtransactions can also be a problem. Sometimes I remember this with Bungie spending a lot of dev time and effort on making more and more marketable cosmetic content rather than focusing on certain pain points. Well, that's more of cosmetics revealing the issue of Bungie's priorities. Yeah, I think it's... But I mean, I think you also bring up a point too, where sometimes marketable cosmetic content can look infinitely better than content you can receive in the game, and therefore now the average player feels as if their armor upgrades or their weapon upgrades will never match the person who had $5 to spend. And that's also a bad feeling, and that can actually push more people away, which could hurt your bottom line more than you're making off of the cosmetic microtransactions. I don't think that's true, but it does affect how players feel about your game and play your game. If they feel like they can just never catch up or never look as good as people who spend real money.
Everybody plays it the same way. And I can see this argument for online player versus player games, but for single player games, I never have quite understood this argument.
Agree.
Control yourself. You don't want save games,
don't save
anywhere in the game. You just want them in certain locations. Okay, turn that option off.
Yeah.
But people are like, no, don't give me the option. I can't control myself. And the question then is, are these objectors in the minority? Is it just a few people who don't like it, or is it a lot? Or does that not even matter? Should you not take that into account? Well, guess what? Some of these hand-holdy features enter the territory of accessibility.
Yep.
You're trying to make your game not just have a broader appeal, but literally allow more and more people to play the game who otherwise physically wouldn't have been able to play it.
Yes.
This is a big thing for me with my color blindness. Without color blindness options, there's a lot of games I literally can't play. So as hand-holdy as it may seem, some of these options seem, some people can't play a game without aim assist or some of the other difficulty options or things like that. So as with any of the things I've talked here about, these hand-holdy things are a spectrum. So no matter what the designer chooses to do in a game, for some people, some players will go, that's too much, you've gone way too far. And other people will say, you haven't done enough. I can't believe you didn't put these really common expected options in the game. And in this sense, hand-holdy options are and game simplification, it's no different than any other choices the designer needs to make. You basically have to decide what your design...
Who do you want to shit on? It's really what it comes down to. It's like, I know not putting martial combat in Golden Chronicles will make some people not want to play it. That's a choice I made, but also I think that having only alchemy combat will make others want to play it too. So, it's just be conscious of what decisions you make and how that might affect the player base as a whole. That's why knowing your market early on is crucial to any game. Know who you're trying to sell this to. Know everything about that, that person, that golden customer. What age are they? What gender are they most likely? Are they male or female? Are they, casual gamers? Are they hardcore gamers? How much time do they spend playing a game every day, right? Because if your average audience only spends 1 hour playing the game, but your levels take 2 hours to complete, maybe your gameplay loop is too long, right? Maybe you need to simplify that. So knowing more about who you intend to show the game off to and have play your game and have purchase your game is crucial to making design decisions. And if you don't do that early enough, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot.
POV is. So what I usually do is I make a base game, and by base game I mean either there are no options or these are what the default options are set to, and I make it work the way I want it to work.
Same.
And then I provide options for players to change things they want. Sometimes accessibility options are included to let people change the game so they literally are capable of playing it. And then some of them are difficulty options, like this makes the game easier to play. This makes certain things in the game easier to notice or easier to perform. Not possible. Like it's possible either way. This just makes it more obvious or easier to do. And in that sense, I don't think this has anything. Game simplification isn't any different than other videos I've talked about, and I'll link below to things like balancing game features and whether you should even have difficulty settings and what type in your game. Because I've talked about that before. They all have some bearing on this, but game simplification is different enough that I thought I'd give it its own video, and I hope, VA Chemist, this answered your questions.
Yeah, great video. A lot to think, but I agree. In general, single player games, do what you want. Multiplayer games, though, there probably is some limit, but it just depends on the game. People talk about knowing your audience as if it's just some marketing thing, but it's essential for gameplay design, especially when designing within a genre. You're absolutely right. Yeah, it's just, I see so many people jump into working on a game, but they haven't asked even the simplest question, like, would people want to buy this game? Is there actually a market? Because if you're not designing a game that is marketable, then why are you making the game? Professionally, right? You might be a hobbyist. You might be making it for whatever, for yourself. That's fine. But if you're working professionally in the industry, you need to make a game that sells. And you need to know how much you expect to sell by analyzing competition, analyzing the size of the audience, of your demographic. If, Cauldron Chronicles is, people age, like, let's say between 20 to 45, how many gamers exist in that realm? If my game is primarily marketed towards a female audience, how many female 20 to 45-year-old gamers are there? And then multiply this by, let's say, the number of females playing a certain genre, right? To get a rough idea. Okay, there are, 10 million, let's just say 10 million women that would fit within our target audience. Where did they spend their time? Oh, it's mostly on TikTok or Instagram. Okay, these are prime places to market to. They're not on Steam. Or maybe it's a primarily male audience. So it's like, okay, let's do YouTube marketing, because YouTube is primarily a male market, right? So, know where these people are, know where they are, because yes, it is for marketing, but it's also for design decisions of, well, what kind of features do they look for? What kind of games are they playing when they come home? How much time do they play? All these things matter to how you develop your game and how you might design it, 100%. It's going to be hit with the ladies. I think that it is slightly more leaning towards ladies than it is men, but that might change. I think with more combat becoming a focus, I think that we are starting to push towards the male audience too. I think in the end, it's going to be like 50-50. But yeah, this was a great video. Guys, here's the link if you want to like it. And if you're watching on YouTube, thank you for watching that one. I hope that was informative. Go subscribe to Tim Cain because he's a goat. And I'll catch you in the next one. Bye, YouTube.